Muy bien. Entonces damos inicio a la segunda conferencia del profesor Hendrik Lorenz de la Universidad de Princeton con el trabajo titulado Being, Knowledge and Opinion in Republic Book 5. Hendrik, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Edgar and Ricardo, for inviting me to participate in this conference. Very excited to be here. And I'll just go straight into the paper in the interest of time. My goal in this paper is to present and explain an interpretation of the difficult argument about knowledge and opinion at the end of Book 5 of the Republic, more precisely at 476 E6 to 480 A13, so the last few pages of Book 5. The interpretation that I will offer owes much to Leslie Brown's proposals about how to understand the Greek verb enai, normally translated as to be. Along the way, a metaphysical picture will gradually come into view, but it's not my purpose in this paper to even try to offer an adequate characterization, analysis, or philosophical evaluation of that metaphysical picture. My topic is the argument itself, and in particular the interpretation of the many occurrences of the verb to be in the course of the argument. I will talk about knowledge and opinion as they feature in the argument, and I will make some comments about the metaphysics that I think the argument implies or suggests. But what I will say about Plato's metaphysics and epistemology will be quite preliminary and will come from the perspective of this particular argument. Since this argument isn't Plato's last word about either metaphysics or epistemology, even in the Republic, much less in the dialogues overall, my comments should not be construed as pertaining to the Republic as a whole or to Plato's philosophy overall. And just to be clear about the limitations of my project in this paper, I will not attempt to say anything at all about any developments in Plato's metaphysics or epistemology that we may plausibly find in later dialogues, such as the Sophist or the Theaetetus. So it's a sort of a fairly limited and restricted project, and it focuses very much on this particular argument, on those few pages at the end of Book 5 of the Republic. The argument. It's famous but difficult to follow. In the present section, I offer a summary of the argument with some comments. In the section after that, I turn to the difficulty on which I want to focus, which is the interpretation of the frequent occurrences of the verb to be. The main steps of the argument are as follows. I will come back to sort of these two steps, A and B, in what follows. That's why I've given them letters. So A, knowledge, the Greek word there is gnosis, is set over what is. That's at 477 A10. And B, ignorance, the word initially used to refer to it, and that's translated by me and others as ignorance, is agnosia, which is not the same, of course, as agnoia. And I will make something of this fact. Agnosia is a relatively rare word in Plato, and I will say something about the significance of this presently. But in any case, claim B, right, is that ignorance is of necessity set over what is not. That's at 477 A10 to 11. And these claims rest on the agreement, which is text 1 on my handout. I think you all have copies of the handout, right? They have been distributed. So text 1 on the handout, that's 477 A3 to 4, says this: what in every way is, translated it differently. What is in every way is knowable in every way. And what is in no way is completely unknowable. One could translate differently, right? What completely is completely knowable, and what is in no way, or what completely is not, is completely unknowable. There are different sort of variations, but I've also put the Greek there so that you can have a look at this. In any case, right? So claims A, knowledge is set over what is, and claim B, ignorance is of necessity set over what is not, is sort of supposed to rest on that text, 477 A3 to 4. Socrates then indicates the possibility that there might be something intermediate between being and not being. He asks, and this is text 2 on the handout, 477a 6 to 8, if anything is such as both to be and not to be, won't it be intermediate between what purely is and what in no way is? Next, he suggests that there should be an intermediate cognitive state if these intermediates, right, these things that are intermediate between being and not being, exist. He asks, and this is text 3 on my handout, 477a 10 to b2, as knowledge is set over what is, while ignorance, and there, right, it's agnosia, while ignorance is of necessity set over what is not, mustn't we find an intermediate between knowledge and ignorance? And there actually goes to agnosia, right? So in the course of this little text, text 3, there's replacement in the Greek of agnoia, rather of agnosia with agnoia, right? What initially gets introduced as agnosia then gets picked up as agnoia. And I translated both as ignorance for now. So as knowledge is set over what is, while ignorance is of necessity set over what is not, mustn't we find an intermediate between knowledge and ignorance to be set over what is intermediate between what is and what is not, if there is such a thing? After that, Socrates introduces opinion, doxa, and understanding, episteme, as two powers. Understanding and opinion are two distinct powers on the grounds that understanding is an infallible power and opinion a fallible one. That happens at 477 7 to 8. I haven't put that on the handout because I don't want to focus on it. A fallible power could not be the same as an infallible power. Socrates then enunciates a questionable principle about the individuation of powers. I'll read out the principle just for the sake of completeness, but I don't mean to focus on it, which is why I haven't put it on the handout. But I thought I just cannot sort of pass over it without a comment. So the principle is at 477c6 following, a power has neither color nor shape nor any feature of the sort that many other things have, and that are used to distinguish between those, to distinguish those things from one another. In the case of a power, I use only what it is set over and what it does. And by reference to these, I call each the power it is. What is set over the same things and does the same, I call the same power. What is set over something different and does something different, I call a different one. A problem for this principle, but I just sort of mentioned it in passing, I don't mean to sort of focus in on it. A problem for this principle is that it seems to assume that powers that are set over the same things will also do the same thing, and that powers that are set over different things will also do different things. And this seems to disregard the possibility that two different powers might be set over the same objects, but do different things to them, or that two different powers might do the same thing, but two different objects. For example, animal husbandry and butchery seem to deal with the same objects, livestock or something like this, but do different things to livestock. The example is due to Gail Fine. Now, this leads Socrates to a questionable step, but again, this is not a step I want to focus on. From the claim that understanding and opinion are different powers, Socrates infers that each of them is by nature set over something different and does something different. And one might think that all that is warranted is the inference that the two powers must either be set over something different or do something different. Next, Socrates infers that since understanding is set over what is, opinion must be set over something other than what is. Therefore, he says, if what is knowable, gnoston is the Greek, if what is knowable, gnoston, the opinable, doxaston, must be something other than what is. That's at 478b3. The last task is to say what opinion, doxa, is set over. First, it's agreed that opinion is set over something. This is text 4 on the handout, 478b5 to 7. Do we then opine what is not? Socrates asks, or is it impossible to opine what is not? Think about this. Doesn't someone who opines set his opinion over something? Or is it impossible to opine, yet to opine nothing? It's impossible, says Glaucon at 478b8. And this is an important step in the argument. Opinion cannot be set over what is not, Socrates suggests, and Glaucon accepts, because what is not is nothing. But that's text 5 on the handout, 478b11 to c1, right? The text is as follows: however, the most accurate way of referring to what is not as some one thing, but as nothing. That's a question, right? But of course it gets accepted. And so it's a step in the argument. Then Socrates proposes to locate opinion in between knowledge and ignorance. Opinion is placed in between knowledge and ignorance on the grounds that it's more obscure or darker than knowledge and clearer or brighter than ignorance. As we might say, opinion is cognitively inferior to knowledge, but superior to ignorance. Socrates follows up with a back reference to 477a, to the beginning of the argument. Close to the beginning of the argument, they had agreed that if there is something intermediate between what is and what is not, something intermediate between knowledge and ignorance will be needed. It turns out that there is a power intermediate between knowledge and ignorance, namely opinion, doxa. The last step that needs to be taken then is to identify the things that are intermediate between what is and what is not. Socrates suggests that such intermediate things do exist, and that there are the many beautiful, big, small, light, heavy things, and so on. According to Socrates' imagined interlocutor, a representative of the lovers of sights and sounds, there's no such thing as the beautiful itself, a single thing that is the beautiful or the just, etc. There are many beautiful things, many just things, and so on. Furthermore, every one of the many beautiful things also presents, the Greek there is phainete, so I translate that as presenting as, so every one of the many beautiful things also presents as ugly, every one of the many just things also presents as unjust, and so on. Then Socrates asks, is any of the many things, the many beautiful things, the many just things, etc., what someone says it is, any more than it is not what he says it is? On behalf of the lovers of sights and sounds, Glaucon answers in the negative, albeit in a somewhat roundabout way. So the idea is that every one of the many beautiful things also presents as and is ugly. Every one of the many just things also presents as and is unjust, etc. One upshot then is that the many beautiful things, the many just things, etc., are the things that are in between what is and what is not. By contrast, the beautiful itself, the just itself, etc., are the things that are in every way, completely or purely. The conclusion of the argument is that knowledge is set over the beautiful itself, the just itself, and so on, and that opinion is set over the many beautiful things, the many just things, etc. Those who don't grasp the beautiful itself lack knowledge about beauty and are therefore limited to mere opinion about it, and likewise for the just itself and everything else that follows the same pattern. Right, that's just supposed to be a quick tour through the argument itself, and I now want to focus on the topic that is the primary target of my project in this paper, which is being, enai. As everybody knows, it's a major challenge of the interpretation to make sense of the frequent occurrences in the argument of the verb enai, to be. According to one picture that is long-standing and massively influential, there are three distinct potentially relevant uses of the verb to be. First, the existential is. On this construal, when Socrates says X, something or other, is, he means it exists. Second, the predicative is. When Socrates says X is, he means that X is such and such, where the predicate is either explicitly supplied or implied by the context. Third, veridical. When Socrates says that something is, he has in mind that it's true or that it is the case. Now, I think that it's impossible to make satisfactory sense of the argument as a whole in terms of just one of these different senses or alleged senses of the Greek verb to be. At different times in the argument, different interpretations of the verb seem to be called for or to be required by the context. For example, at the start of the argument, Socrates says that knowledge is set over what is, and that there can only be ignorance concerning what is not. A bit later, he identifies what is not and nothing. He there claims that it's impossible for the power of opinion to be set over what is not, on the grounds that what is not is nothing, and to opine is to apply the power of opinion to something rather than nothing. Now, this seems to call for and has often resulted in existential interpretations of to be. Knowledge is of what exists. On an interpretation along those lines, one cannot know and hence can only be ignorant of what does not exist. To form an opinion at all, one must apply one's mind to something that exists. The latter idea, right, that in order to form an opinion, you need to apply your mind to something that exists, this may be wrong, but it's at least not obviously nonsensical. In any case, these claims cannot be made adequate sense of just in terms of the predicative interpretation of to be. Whatever the relevant predicates may be, for example, beautiful, big, heavy, or whatever, any given thing can lack any of these predicates and still be a possible object of knowledge or at least opinion. On the other hand, towards the end of the argument, this is at 479 BD, Plato moves from noting that the many beautiful, big, heavy things, etc., are also the opposites in question. So, right, for the beautiful things ugly, for the big things small, for the heavy things light, etc. So he moves from that claim to the claim that they are and are not, or that they're intermediate between being and not being, rolling around as intermediates between what purely is and what purely is not. That's text 6 on the handout. And here we will want to avoid an existential interpretation on pain of saddling Plato with a fallacy from the fact that something is beautiful in one way and ugly in another. It doesn't follow that it both exists and doesn't exist, being somehow intermediate between existence and non-existence. And so it may seem as if Plato is confused between distinct and different senses of the verb enai, to be. In certain places of the argument, he seems to use the verb in its existential sense. At other times, he seems to switch without warning to the predicative sense. And in switching around in these ways, he might be confused, or he might try to confuse his interlocutor or the reader, trying to trick them into accepting his conclusions. A relatively recent suggestion made by Leslie Brown, this goes back to papers published in 1986 and then 1994, is that it's a mistake to distinguish sharply between an existential use and a predicative sense or use of the Greek verb enai, because, she argues, there is in Greek no sharp division between such uses. Leslie Brown's suggestion is this: a Greek sentence of the form X is, where the is not the veridical is a syntactically complete sentence. I go slightly beyond what Brown is suggesting in adding that such sentences can be glossed as meaning X has being or X is real or something like that. Moreover, Brown continues, it will always make sense in Greek for someone to ask the follow-up question, is what? Right? When one sort of Greek speaker says that, for example, Socrates is, then it will make sense for another speaker to ask a follow-up question, is what? In answering that question, one can supplement or augment the original sentence of the form X is, and to illustrate this idea and to emulate it in English, Brown suggests an analogy. Jane teaches, right, so treat that as an example sentence of English, is a syntactically complete sentence. Still, it makes sense to ask the follow-up question, teaches what? Jane teaches French is an amplified or augmented version of Jane teaches. Both are syntactically complete sentences. Neither of them is elliptical. In other words, neither stands in need of syntactic or grammatical completion. Analogously, Brown's suggestion is, X is, right? So Socrates Este, for example, is a syntactically complete sentence. Again, I add that such a sentence means something like X is real or X has being, but it can be augmented or supplemented by suitable predicates so as to get something of the form X is F. Note that this doesn't work with English sentences of the form X exists. Such sentences do not allow the follow-up question, exists what? Nor do they allow augmentation so as to yield sentences of the form X exists F. This is why, if Brown is right, exist is not a good English translation of the Greek verb to be, at least not in the context of our argument at the end of Republic 5. That's not to say that it's never an acceptable translation. It just is to sort of call attention to limitations of the translation exist. To complete the exposition of my version of Brown's proposal, it will follow from X is F that X is or has being, just as one can infer from the fact that Jane teaches French, that Jane teaches. Moreover, if X is or has being, this entails that X is something or other, just as it follows from the fact that Jane teaches, that she teaches something or other. One crucial feature of Brown's proposal is that as one moves from complete but unsupplemented sentences of the form X is to complete but supplemented sentences of the form X is F, and also as one moves in the opposite direction, no change in the sense or meaning of the verb to be is involved. This is just like moving from Jane teaches to Jane teaches French, and back from there to Jane teaches. In both sentences, the verb to teach is used in exactly the same sense, use or meaning. But if you were to write a dictionary entry of the verb to teach, you wouldn't have one use where it corresponds to sort of complete unsupplemented uses, as in Jane teaches, and another sense where there's a supplemented use, as in Jane teaches French. This is one and the same meaning, use, or sense of the English verb to teach. Right, and the proposal is that the same is true of ani, between complete and unsupplemented uses of ani and complete and supplemented uses of ani. By contrast, it's an important feature of the standard view, the view of ani that Brown is opposing, and which sharply distinguishes between existential and predicative uses of the Greek verb to be, that if sentences of the form X is are complete sentences, then in them the verb to be is used with a different sense from the sense in which it's used in sentences of the form X is F. Or in the first kind of case, but not in the second kind of case, is means exists. I will now try to show how Brown's proposal about the verb to be can be employed to obtain a viable interpretation of our argument. Along the way, we will encounter a difficulty for Brown's interpretation as it stands, but I think we can solve the difficulty by correcting a mistake on Brown's part. This mistake is, I think, incidental to Brown's proposal about the verb to be. Let's begin by revisiting the argument's main claims with Brown's proposal in mind and see what sense we can make of them. So going back now to claim A, knowledge is set over what is. Right, again, I'm now using Brown's proposal to try to make sense of that claim and the other claims that we have seen in our sort of quick run through the argument. So knowledge is set over what is. The idea is that knowledge is of what has being, or of things that have being, or of things that are real. Such things are ones that bear predicates, at least one predicate in each case. After all, it follows from something having being that it is something or other, just as it follows from someone's being a teacher that they are a teacher of something or other. About something that has being, you can ask, what is it? And there will be at least some true answers, at least one true answer, although of course you may not know what they are or what it is. B, ignorance is of necessity set over what is not. As we saw, this rests on the claim that what is in no way is completely unknowable. This too makes good sense on the Leslie Brown proposal. The idea is that there can be no knowledge at all of what isn't anything at all. What is in no way, one has to read this with emphasis. What is in no way isn't anything at all, just as someone who teaches in no way doesn't teach anything at all. As we saw, Socrates also speaks of what is in every way, saying that what is in every way is knowable in every way. By implicit here, this kind of expression suggests the idea of something that is, but that fails to be in every way, or to be completely. Right? Something that is in a way, but is not in every way. Or something that is, but isn't completely. In other words, it suggests from the start that being might not be an all or nothing affair. Instead, there might be room for a distinction between being in every way or being completely and being only in a way. Now, it's not immediately obvious how this can be emulated by way of the analogy between teaching and being that Leslie Brown proposed. I think that it can be done, and that this possibility is important for a successful construal of Plato's argument. I will return to this point shortly. For now, let's turn to the intermediate objects, the things that, according to Socrates, roll around between being and not being. As we saw, Socrates argues for their existence as follows. Each of the many beautiful things is also ugly, in a different setting, in a different context of comparison, etc. He asks, and this is text 7 on the handout, then do you know how to deal with them? Or can you find a more appropriate place to put them than intermediate between being and not being? Surely they cannot be more obscure than what is not, so as to not be more than what is not, or be clearer than what is, so as to be more than what is. What Socrates seems to have in mind is that the many beautiful things in fact are and are not, or have being and fail to have being. Moreover, it looks as if Socrates tries to infer this from the fact that they are and are not beautiful. Now, this is fine on the positive side of things. Socrates can infer that the many beautiful things are from the fact that they're beautiful. With Leslie Brown's proposal in hand, we can say that this is like inferring that Jane teaches from the fact that she teaches French. There's nothing wrong with this inference. But it may look like a serious mistake on the negative side. Consider what Brown calls schema U for unhealthy. So this is on the handout, on page 2 of the handout, right? Leslie Brown's schema U for unhealthy. So the schema goes as follows, and sort of I apologize for the formalism in what follows. I'm going to talk a lot about different inference patterns or inference schemata. So here's one. First, X is F, and then entails that X is. And second, X is not F, and that's supposed to entail that X is not. Now, the first of these patterns of inference is fine, as we have seen, but the second one is not. Relying on it would be like trying to infer that Jane doesn't teach from the fact that Jane doesn't teach French. Any such inference fails, of course. Jane's being a teacher is obviously quite compatible with her not being a teacher of French. She might be a math teacher, after all. On Brown's view, Plato, in the course of the argument, not only tries to infer as follows, so this is just a restatement of the second pattern of inference, X is not F, and then this entails X is not. Brown also thinks that in this schema, X is not is equivalent to X isn't anything at all. And so Brown proposes to understand this schema as the following pattern of inference, right? So this is on the handout 2 prime, where it's inferred from X is not F that X is not anything at all. This could also be stated equivalently, right, as 2 double prime X is not F, and then it follows X is in no way. But I think this is a mistake of interpretation on Leslie Brown's part, And I also think that this mistake is separable from her proposal about the Greek verb to be. Socrates in our argument does not, I think, try to infer that something isn't anything at all, or is in no way, from the fact that it's not, say, beautiful. Rather, I suggest that he relies on the following pattern of inference. So this is 2 triple prime, right, on my handout. X is not F in a way, and this is supposed to entail that X is not in a way. Recall that Socrates sets up the extremes between which the many X things fall as what is in every way, antelos on in Greek, and what is in no way, me on the medame, right? That's at 477A3, that's on your handout. In fact, right, that's text 1 on the handout. In doing so, Socrates is opening up the intermediate possibility of things that are in some ways and also are not in some ways. As we saw, Socrates also treats the expression being in every way and being purely as interchangeable. So it's elikrinos, purely. And so we can describe the extremes as, that's sort of an alternative way, right? That sort of is also in play in the argument. We can describe the extremes also as, on the one hand, what is purely or unmixedly, and on the other hand, what purely or unmixedly is not. In this way, too, we can obtain space for the intermediate possibility of impure or mixed beings, beings that have an admixture of not being. Furthermore, Socrates clearly takes it to be possible for something both to be and not to be. And clearly this is important for the overall argument, since Socrates is trying to show the existence of things that both are and are not. And so I think that the inference schema on which Socrates is relying is as follows, and this is item 3 on the handout. This is really, on my view, the most important schema. So 3, right? X is F in a way, and is not F in a way. And then this is supposed to entail that X is in a way and is not in a way. It is this schema, not Leslie Brown's schema U for unhealthy, that Plato needs in our argument. And I will now try to make this schema palatable. To get going, consider a few examples. I begin with the English verbs to eat and to teach, and then I turn to examples that employ the inference schema 3, which I have just now ascribed to Socrates. So my examples are all on the handout. Example 1, picky eater. Jane is eating her noodles, but she's not eating her salad. Question about the situation, is Jane eating? Yes and no. She's eating her noodles, and that's supposed to entail that she is eating in a way, but she's not eating her salad. And that's supposed to entail that she's not eating in a way. Right? That's supposed to sort of give you the rationale for saying yes and no in answer to the question whether she's eating. Example 2, I will sort of work with these examples as we proceed. I'm just now introducing them. Example 2, fatigued teacher. Because of a medical condition, Thomas regularly teaches for the first half hour of each class, but then he can't continue and needs a half-hour break. Is Thomas teaching? And I'm supposed to answer now. You're supposed to sort of, I'm trying to get you into a frame of mind where you find it natural to say yes and no. Thomas is teaching for half of each class, so he's teaching in a way. He's not teaching for the other half of each class, so he's not teaching in a way, right? And that's supposed to sort of rationalize and make intuitive the answer yes and no to the question, is he teaching? Now, it seems to me that in these 2 examples, the answer yes and no is intelligible. And even, I hope, if these examples don't work, I think that maybe better examples can be found. But the idea is that they can be made intuitive, that this way of sort of thinking can be made intuitive. One can warm oneself up intellectually to sort of answering these kinds of questions in these kinds of situations by saying yes and no. My examples are, of course, designed to open up space for intermediates between the positive and the negative states of affairs, so that eating, teaching, etc. are not necessarily all or nothing affairs. I now want to apply this pattern of thinking and speaking to questions of being. So it gets a bit more difficult now. right? Partly because I'm relying on the Leslie Brown construal sort of how the Greek verb enai behaves, and that's of course controversial, but sort of bear with me on this point. Example 3, beauty. What is beautiful? So that's now the question we focus on, and let's consider the answer: iridescent green. Iridescent green is beautiful in the coat of a bird. Consider the quetzal bird, for example. It's a wonderfully beautiful and striking bird, and it's beautiful, at least in part, because of the amazing iridescent green in its plumage. If someone could put a picture, picture of the quetzal bird would be wonderful, but you can imagine one, or summon one on your phone or laptop. It's a really very beautiful bird. But iridescent green is ugly and so not beautiful in a loaf of bread. Right? Just imagine a loaf of bread that has that color. You wouldn't find this appetizing. You'd be sort of repulsed by it. And if you saw a painting of a loaf of bread and it sort of had patches of iridescent green, you would think that's ugly. At least not beautiful, right? So then this is supposed to support the inference, and I realize this is a bit hard. I will sort of work hard to make that intelligible and intuitive. So iridescent green is beautiful in a way, and this is supposed to entail that it is in a way. Also then negatively, iridescent green is not beautiful in a way, and this is supposed to entail that it is not in a way. Now, on the face of things, it looks odd to try to infer from the fact that iridescent green is not beautiful, that it is not in a way, where this is supposed to mean that it's not real in a way, or that it fails to have being in a way. I have two responses to this objection. One of these is more modest, the other one is bolder. The two responses support two metaphysical pictures, where again, one of them is more modest, the other is bolder. The bolder one entails the more modest one. Let me begin with the more modest picture and the more modest response to the objection. To bring it into view, we have to restrict the context of consideration to beautiful things. We're talking about beautiful things, and we are considering relevant cases. In this context of consideration, iridescent green comes up as a case. Right, so we're discussing beautiful things. We're asking people to come up with cases of beauty, of beautiful things, and someone says iridescent green. Now, I suggest that it makes sense to say that considered as something beautiful, iridescent green is in a way and is not in a way. This is supposed to mean that considered as something beautiful, iridescent green is real in a way and is not real in a way. Or in other words, so considered, iridescent green has being in a way and fails to have being in a way, right? Considered as a case of beauty, it's real in a way and not real in another way. Just to get accustomed to this way of thinking and speaking, consider another example. So it's my fourth example, justice. What is just is the question, and the answer comes up, returning what one owes. Returning what one owes is just on many occasions, but also returning what one owes is unjust, and so not just on many occasions. Right? And this is supposed to support two inferences. Returning what one owes is just in a way. We infer from this that it is in a way. Returning what one owes is not just in a way. We infer from this that it's not in a way. Again, suppose that the context of consideration concerns cases of justice. Considered as something just, returning what one owes is in a way and is not in a way. It is real in a way and it's not real in a way. It has being in a way and it doesn't have being in another way. Now, it might be objected that by restricting the context of consideration in this way, right, to beautiful things in the first case and to just things in the second case, I am in effect smuggling in a predicative interpretation of the verb to be. If you say that considered as a just thing, returning what one owes in a way is not, or in a way is not real, aren't we simply saying that returning what one owes in a way is not just, or in a way is not really just? I don't think so. To say that considered as a just thing, returning what one owes in a way is not, or is not real, is to make a general point about returning what one owes. The point is that returning what one owes is a defective case of justice. Considered as a case of justice, it's not completely real. This is not another way of saying that returning what one owes is not just on many occasions. It's to make a generalizing inference about returning what one owes, namely that it's a defective case of justice. This general point about returning what one owes applies even in cases in which returning what one owes turns out to be just. This is parallel to the examples about eating and teaching. To say that Jane in a way isn't eating is to say that Jane is a defective eater. It's not simply to restate that there is something that Jane isn't eating, namely her salad. To say that Thomas in a way isn't teaching is not just to record that Thomas fails to teach half of the time. It's to offer a general characterization of Thomas as a defective teacher. This characterization applies to Thomas even when it turns out, even while it turns out that he is in fact teaching. There's a certain metaphysical picture that emerges from these ways of thinking and speaking. On this picture, iridescent green is a metaphysically defective case of beauty, just as returning what one owes is a metaphysically defective case of justice. Even the beautiful iridescent green of the quetzal bird's plumage is defective as a case of beauty. To say this is not to disparage the bird's appearance. The bird's iridescent green plumage really is beautiful. But since the very same color, iridescent green, that is so beautiful in a bird's plumage, is ugly in many other situations, for example in a loaf of bread, the color itself, iridescent green, is a defective case of beauty. Considered as a case of beauty, its very being is defective and impure. In this sense, the defect is metaphysical. A parallel point can be made about returning what one owes as a case of justice. Considered as a case of justice, returning what one owes is defective, even in the many situations in which returning what one owes turns out to be the just thing to do. In those situations, there's of course no moral defect in returning what one owes. But in cases where it's the right thing to do to return what one owes, there's no moral defect in returning what one owes. But on the metaphysical picture that I'm trying to paint, the defect of returning what one owes is as a case of justice, is not necessarily moral, but metaphysical. It rests on the fact that while returning what one owes is often just, it is also on many occasions unjust and so not just. Now, while this metaphysical picture is, I think, intelligible and plausibly Platonic, the interpretation of our argument that I have arrived at raises a question. Addressing this question will naturally lead to the bolder metaphysical picture that I've already hinted at. The question is how my interpretation fares in making sense of claims A and B. Recall that these claims are the following. Knowledge is set over what is, that's claim A, and B, ignorance is of necessity set over what is not. As we saw before, these rest on the agreement that what is in every way is knowable in every way, and what is in no way is completely unknowable. So I take the claims really to be that knowledge is set over what is in every way, and that ignorance is of necessity set over what is in no way. I also take it that what is in no way is what isn't anything at all, and so is not something, but nothing. But there's strong textual support for this. In consequence, I take ignorance to be not a cognitive power alongside knowledge and opinion, but lack of cognition. The fact that Socrates first introduces the relevant notion of ignorance by using the rare word agnosia at 477a10 lends some support to this interpretation. The idea is that since any cognition must latch onto something, what is not anything at all cannot support any cognition at all. But now it's incumbent on me to accept and make sense of the following inference patterns. First, X is in every way F. This is supposed to entail that X is in every way. And also second, X is not F at all. And this is supposed to entail that X is in no way. It's nothing. Once again, let's start with examples about eating and teaching and then turn to questions about being. the analogs of 1, right, x is in every way, therefore x is in every way, would be the following: Jane is eating her noodles and her salad. Jane is eating in every way. Thomas is teaching the whole of each class. It follows that Thomas is teaching in every way. It's a complete teacher. The analogies of 2 would be, so the negative cases, Jane is not eating anything at all. It follows that Jane is in no way eating. She isn't eating at all. And Thomas is not teaching any part of any class at all. Follows that Thomas is in no way teaching. He isn't teaching at all. Now, these inferences seem to me to be fine, but what about beauty and justice? On the positive side, let's help ourselves to the Platonic forms of beauty and justice, conceived of as items that are invariably beautiful and invariably just. This will take care of pattern 1, the positive kind of inference, as follows. The form of beauty is in every way beautiful. It follows that the form of beauty is in every way. The form of justice is in every way just. It follows that the form of justice is in every way. But how about inference pattern 2? Can we make sense of trying to infer that something is in no way from the fact that it isn't beautiful at all, or that it isn't just at all? Once again, the modest metaphysical picture may be helpful. We are restricting consideration to cases of beauty or to cases of justice. Now, suppose there is something that isn't beautiful at all. Given the Platonic or Platonist conception of reality, this may be challenging or impossible. And I think that's an important point, and I will return to it shortly. Perhaps the case of justice is a bit more straightforward. Let us say that such things as mud, hair, and dirt are not just at all. Such things are not even legible as cases of justice. Now, in the context of consideration restricted to cases of justice, dirt does not show up. It's a no-show, a non-entity. Relatedly, dirt is not cognizable as a case of justice. If someone sincerely asserts that dirt is a case of justice, it can be argued, and I think plausibly, that this is not an expression of an opinion, not even of a false opinion. Rather, it's an expression of profound ignorance, of a radical lack of cognitive contact with justice. And perhaps this is enough to make sense of claims A and B. We already saw that with respect to beauty, it's plausible that for Plato, there is nothing that is real in any way that completely lacks beauty. And the same, I think, is true of goodness. And so it seems that Plato would accept the following inferences. X is in every way good. It follows that X is in every way, that is real in every way. And X is not good at all. It follows that X is in no way, that it's not real at all. How about the intermediate case? What to make of the following inference? X is good in a way and not good in a way, and then that's supposed to follow that X is in a way and is not in a way. Again, we could try to make sense of this inference by restricting the context of consideration to cases of goodness as before. And I think this would be a viable strategy. But at this point, I want to propose a bolder metaphysical picture. Suppose you think that some features or aspects of reality are metaphysically privileged in that they confer being and reality on other things, and also that they constitute beings and realities in their own right. Goodness and beauty are plausible candidates for having such a privileged status, and perhaps other evaluative features as well as mathematical features play some such roles. Now, recall that in the course of our argument, Socrates offers an open-ended list of features that he takes to characterize the many things that he thinks roll around between being and not being. Beauty, justice, the double and the half, large and small, heavy and light. With respect to these features, he says that all of the many things that have these features also have the opposite features. This invites the thought that all of the many things that we encounter in our perceptual experience are pervasively characterized by opposites. For everything that they can truly be said to be, they can also truly be said not to be that thing, but the very opposite. And this thought brings into view a bolder metaphysical picture, and a bolder way of making sense of the inference from negative predication to metaphysical defectiveness. The idea is that all perceptible things are F in a way and not F in a way for all the relevant values of F, so that all of their being is defective. In order to illustrate this proposal, let us return for a moment to Jane the teacher. Suppose she is a defective teacher of French because her knowledge of the language is quite rusty, and she really shouldn't be teaching it. But we cannot infer that she is a defective teacher tout court, because she might be a stellar teacher of math. But now suppose that all of her teaching is defective no matter the subject. Then it's fair to infer that she is a defective teacher tout court. And likewise, it's fair to infer that X is a defective being if for every feature which it has and whose possession by it confers being on it, it's true to say that it has that feature only in a way, while in another way it lacks it. Now, obviously, this is not the time or the place for me to offer a full discussion of this bolder metaphysical picture. I will limit myself to calling attention to the characterization of the form of beauty in the symposium, with its implied contrast between beauty itself and the many beautiful things. This is text 8, the last text on the handout, where Diotima says, first, it always is, so she's speaking about the form of beauty or beauty itself, it always is, and neither comes to be nor passes away, neither waxes nor wanes. Second, it is not beautiful in one way and ugly in another way, nor beautiful at one time and ugly at another, nor beautiful in relation to one thing and ugly in relation to another, nor is it beautiful here but ugly there, as it would be if it were beautiful for some people but ugly for others. The many beautiful things, which include beautiful bodies, souls, activities, and laws, right, in the symposium context, also they include beautiful forms of knowledge. These many beautiful things are things that come into being and pass away, and things that depend for being beautiful on specific situations, relations, and perspectives. By contrast, beauty itself is invariably beautiful in a way that does not depend on particular situations, contexts of comparison, or perspectives. If we generalize this conception to all the features of everything in the perceptible world, we obtain the bolder metaphysical picture that I mentioned before. The being of the forms is complete in that they completely have all the features that constitute their being. To put the point more carefully, the being of the forms is complete in that they completely have all those features in the possession of which their being consists. By contrast, the many things of our perceptual experience have those features in a way and also lack them. They have them at one time but not at another, in one situation but not in another, in one context of comparison but not in another, from one perspective but not in another. This metaphysical picture allows us to make sense of the following patterns of inference. First, X is in every way F. This entails that X is in every way. Second, X is not F at all. It entails that X is in no way. And third, X is F in a way and is not F in a way, will entail that X is in a way and is not in a way. For X, any item whatsoever can be inserted, and for F, you can substitute any feature possessed by the thing in question, the possession of which, by it, constitutes its being, or confers being and reality on it. The upshot is that the forms are in every way, where this means that they are completely real, or have being completely. By contrast, the many things that appear in our perceptual experience both are and are not, where this means that they are and are not real, or that they have being and also fail to have being. Admittedly, this is a bold metaphysical picture, and as I said, I cannot attempt here and now to clarify it, let alone to make it plausible as a philosophical picture. However, I would like to call attention to one advantage of this picture for purposes of interpreting our argument. We call claim B. Ignorance is of necessity set over what is not. On the bold metaphysical picture, this is easy to make sense of. What is not stands for what is in no way. What is in no way lacks any feature that could confer being or reality on it. So what is in no way is nothing, and is not available as an object of any cognitive power or activity. It's radically non-cognizable, and so only lack of cognition, agnosia, can be set over it. In any case, I hope to have done enough to convince you that Leslie Brown's proposal about the verb to be holds promise for the philosophical interpretation of our argument. In fact, I take myself to have shown that it holds even more promise than Brown herself seems to think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was fascinating. My questions are perhaps a sign of me being confused, but looking at first at your three, which does not most of the work. I was wondering where you get three from, and if you get it from Leslie Brown, if you get it from 1 and 2, then it seems to me that 1 and 2, at least it's not obvious that they entail three, because sticking in a way, I mean, it doesn't. It might make a difference to the validity of moving from one and 2 to 3. My other point is I think is more about Leslie Brown. I can't believe that Leslie Brown in her paper is committed to 2 prime. I mean, I may simply have missed it. I haven't read it for years, but I used to know it quite well. I've forgotten most of it now. I haven't forgotten the significance of it. I just have forgotten the ins and outs. But because Leslie is such a scholar on familiar scholar of the sophist, I'm just I find it difficult to believe that she would make this mistake.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for both of these points. Yes, so let me clarify. In answer to the first question, right? The first question is where I get 3 from and whether I get it out of Leslie Brown. The answer is I'm not getting it out of Leslie Brown. It's supposed to be a fix. So it's supposed to be a tweak of mine on Leslie Brown's sort of attempt to use her interpretation in order to make sense of Plato's argument at the end of Republic 5. So that's the sort of quick answer to the question. I can say more sort of by way of justifying, ascribing to Socrates in Republic 5 my inference scheme 3. If you like, I can say more about this. Right. Okay, good. The other thing is, so about whether Leslie Brown is committed, right? This is in particular, actually, it's a claim about the 1994 paper, right, in the Everson collection, and it's not specific. The 1994 paper is not specific to the sophist. The 1986 paper is about the sophist, and then the 1994 paper generalizes, right? Not only to other Platonic texts, such as Republic 5, but also discusses Parmenides and Aristotle. And so, yes, I think she is committed in the 1994 paper to 2 double prime as an analysis of what happens in Republic 5. So the way this works is that she thinks that in the sophist, Plato corrects a mistake that he made in the Republic. So Leslie Brown sort of singles out that mistake in terms of 2 prime. So she thinks Plato takes himself to have made a mistake in the Republic that he corrects in the sophist. So roughly the mistake that he corrects in the sophist is that you cannot infer from X is not F that X is not tout court, because in the sophist he recognizes that something can not be something or other, but still be a being, right? Because the idea is that not being gets analyzed in terms of being different from something. But Leslie Brown thinks that's a sort of breakthrough achievement in the sophist that enables Plato to fix a mistake that he made in the Republic. So the texts in the Leslie Brown 1994 paper, I have the quotations in the footnote, just to sort of get the scholarly details right. So Brown suggests that Plato erred in Republic 5 by allowing the inference from X is not F to X is not. And Leslie Brown proposes that Plato regards the complete is not as equivalent to is not anything at all. So right in this way, if you put these 2 things together, you get the idea that a mistake that Plato made in Republic 5 is to infer from X is not F, roughly from negative predication, X is not anything at all. And so right on Brown's construal, this is a mistake that Plato made in the Republic, but that he fixes in the Sophist. Right, and so I think that's a sort of small mistake that she makes along the way, specifically about the Republic, because there's a more charitable way of interpreting the Republic. This is my 2 triple prime, X is not F in a way, X is not in a way, so that what Plato says in the Republic is compatible with what he says in the Sophist. Because in the Republic, he's not inferring that X isn't anything at all from negative predications about X.
Yeah, thank you for the paper. So there's a discussion in the Hippias Major that's very much in line with your example 3 here, and also your text 8. And that there's a question about beauty. Helen is beautiful, certainly beautiful in relation to the pot, but not beautiful in respect of God. Right. So she's beautiful and not beautiful. That's a way of making sense of what occurs in the Republic. But that seems to me to be a little bit slightly different from your iridescent green example, because in your example, it is green and it is beautiful and it's not beautiful. In the Hippias Major, there are degrees of beauty that are specifically under discussion. So that's the first thing I want to ask you about. And the second one is, what happens if you take, instead of saying the F here is beauty or justice, what happens if the F is being? Then you're going to get something in between being and not being. And if you follow out the Hippias Major example, we'll get something that has, degrees of being. And it seems to me that your conclusion, your strong proposal is very much in line with the idea that there is such a thing as a degree of being. There's the full, complete being of beauty and maybe being itself or justice, and then there's complete non-being, and there's something in between that we can apprehend by doxa, that's somewhat of a lesser degree. So that brings me to the last concern that I have here. You're starting out with Leslie Brown, and I always find her very, very interesting to read. But I think one of her assumptions is it don't make any sense to talk about degrees of being. And certainly something Glass has said it, and lots of other people, Owen and lots of other people have said that. So on the one hand, you're starting with this assumption that let's try to articulate this in terms of being understood, existential or predicative, and then you're coming up with a notion of being that's just, it's not in the picture. So it seems to me that your conclusion has undermined your assumptions, and that you'd be better off just starting out by saying, hey, there's another sense of being here that's not captured. And linguistically, it's very hard to actually express it. And the Republic is one way, Hippias Major seems to be another way, and you get other ways in different dialogues.
Thanks so much. So there are 3 points, right? I'll try to take them in order. I think everything you say I agree with, except the characters. Except I disagree with the one thing that sort of my conclusion undermines my initial assumptions, because the initial assumptions are not mine, I think. So we'll talk about this. So the first point, right, is about the Hippias Major, and I thank you for the example. So this is really a question of what these sort of many beautiful things are supposed to be, right, in the Republic 5, and I'm happy to include among the many beautifuls such individuals as Helen, but I also think that probably we shouldn't limit the many beautiful things to sort of individual substances, to put it in Aristotelian terms, such as Helen. We should also include such things as iridescent green, as a sort of color, perceptible color, but it's not sort of necessarily an individual and it's not a substance. Also things like returning what one owes, right, as an answer to the question of what is justice. So what I'd like to do is to be inclusive about the sort of metaphysical range of the many beautiful things, so that both individual substances get in, and then we can make sense, right, of Helen being beautiful and not being beautiful, either in terms of sort of relationality. She's beautiful compared to a pot, but not beautiful compared to a goddess or whatever. We can also make sense of it in sort of diachronic terms, right? She may be beautiful now, but she may not be beautiful in a few decades' time or something like this. She may not always have been beautiful, may not always be beautiful. Also, she's a perishable person, and so she will not exist and will not be beautiful because she doesn't exist, etc. There are all kinds of moves that one can make. But what I'm meaning to do is just to be inclusive, so that we don't have to limit the many beautiful things to individual substances. That was the reason why I introduced iridescent green and returning what one owes. But I think one could do the same kind of moves, right, with individual substances. The second point about being, right, as to whether I'd be comfortable with introducing sort of as a topic of conversation being, and then somebody proposes a case of being, and then yes.
Yeah. Could you say X is being and just make that be being?
Yes, I think so. Also, the idea would be in this case, someone could propose the form of the good as a candidate. So you ask,
could something be an instance of the form of being? That was my question.
Or could we just make it a case of being?
Could be the same thing.
Yeah, I think so. And then, so I'm to just put my cards on the table. I'm completely comfortable with degrees of being and with sort of things which are mixed beings. They have an admixture of not being. So that one can make sense of that idea. I don't have any problem. And in fact, it sort of naturally flows right out of the interpretation that I'm proposing, that Plato thinks of the forms as complete beings. Then, of course, there's the sort of possibility of something that isn't anything at all. And so that's a complete not being. And then we get sort of intermediates, right, which will be mixed cases of being and not being, impure beings, things which are in a way and are not in a way. And if this then amounts to, right, sort of at least two different grades or degrees of beings, the things that are completely and the things which are not completely, but which also in a way are. So I'm okay with that. But then the last point about the sort of Leslie Brown and whether, in a way, my conclusion undermines the initial assumptions. I think the initial assumptions are these assumptions about existential versus predicative, and what emerges at the end of the paper is that there is a notion of being which we're not well equipped, right, to sort of get a grasp on if we think of being as either existence or sort of predicational. And I agree with that. The reason why I introduced sort of the triple scheme of exist, predication, and veridical is that this is a scheme that I mean to overcome. So if where I go undermines the scheme, that's as it should be. Thank you.
Okay. Before we proceed, there are several questions, and I just want to make sure that I have all your names right. So, Edward spoke now, then Gabriel, then Sarah Lee, then Carolina and Francisco, then John, then Edgar, then Andre. Is that okay? Very well. So, thank you. So, Gabriel.
Thanks a lot, Hendrik. I think I'm convinced that if Brown is going to be fixed, it'll work something like this. If Brown can be fixed, it'll work something like this. I have two worries about the fix. So the first is concerning the schema 2 triple prime. So I take it that you really need this to work out as a schema, because otherwise you won't get 3.
Right.
My worry is that when it comes to forms, 2 triple prime is disastrous. The form of the beautiful is not ugly in many ways. It looks like 2 triple prime then licenses the inference. The form of the beautiful is not in a way. Okay, so that's the first worry. The other one, you didn't have a schema for the positive thing about the forms being in all ways. At least, yeah, you didn't have it on the handout.
Right.
But I think so.
But I do have it in the text.
Yeah, you had
It's X in every way. It is in every way.
Okay, so X is F in every way, then X is in every way?
Yes, it's in the paper, it's not on the handout, because I wanted to focus on the intermediates, right?
Yeah. So I guess the bigger picture worry is like you fix it for the intermediates, but at the cost of them. And here's the worry about
the problem about forms.
The problem, yeah. So X is in every way entails. Sorry, X is F in every way entails X is in every way. I worry about whether this is valid. So if we supply the teaches case, maybe this just went by a bit too quickly for me, but supply Jane teaches French in every way. So X is F in every way, teaches French in every way. Doesn't follow that Jane teaches in every way.
Right.
So she doesn't teach German necessarily. Doesn't follow that she teaches German in any way.
Right.
So I worry about the validity of that student.
Yes. Okay, then I'll just take them in order. So yeah, there's a problem about forms because there should be some true negative predications about forms, right? And I take it that's a problem that Plato confronts and fixes in a way, or proposes to fix in a way, in the Sophist. And so that was the point that I made at the very beginning, that I don't propose to sort of address any kinds of developments in later Platonic texts, and I also don't mean to give a full philosophical analysis of the metaphysical picture that seems to me to emerge from this argument. So there may well be a problem about forms on the interpretation that I propose, but then there's a question of what to make of this. One possibility is that this is a problem for Plato that Plato comes to recognize and fix, in which case it may not be a problem of interpretation, that it sort of lands Plato with this problem. In fact, it may be a merit of the interpretation that it sort of brings out in a vivid and salient kind of way that this problem is going to be there and will need to be addressed. But having said that, I think that internal to the Republic, Plato has resources for solving the problem of negative true predications about forms. And so I tried to put this in terms of the idea that certain features or attributes are metaphysically privileged, in that in having them, the being of something or other consists, sort of features that are constitutive of the being, to put it roughly, of things. And then I restrict the claim about F, right, to those kinds of features. So that the idea will then be, with respect to all the features in the possession by the relevant form of which the being of the form consists, there won't be negative predications. Right? So let's say the being of the form of the good consists in being good. And of course, it's not going to be true, right, that there is any way in which the form of the good is not good. And maybe you can add some other features, right? So for other forms, or even for the form of the good. So I think that's a sort of tweak that Plato might sort of put in place, which might protect him, right, against that problem, or which might in a way solve that problem. I'm not suggesting that this is a problem that Plato has considered in the Republic. I really think it's a problem that Plato confronts and then tries to solve in the Sophist. But I also don't think that it's a sort of obvious idea that undermines the picture in the Republic. I wouldn't accept, right, that the Republic picture that I've sketched suffers from an insurmountable metaphysical problem, which is that one cannot make sense of the idea that something which is completely F must be completely in such a way that this will sort of deliver the result that the forms are completely. Maybe that's enough for now. We can talk more about this, and we will talk more about this, I'm sure. But about the inference concerning teaching and completely teaching. So I thought the idea was, when we say that someone in a way doesn't teach, what we're saying is that they are a defective teacher. And now one can think about sort of what the standards for being a non-defective teacher is, what the standards are for being a non-defective teacher. So I was thinking, you might think that in order to be a completely non-defective teacher, the person has to be a teacher of everything. But I think that's not very plausible. So there's an analysis of what you have to be like in order to be non-defective as a teacher. So the way I tried to model this, right, was in terms of the idea of someone who's not like Thomas, but who teaches every class and the whole of every class, who doesn't fail to teach half of every class they teach. So if Jane teaches French and she teaches every class every minute of every class that she teaches, then she's a non-defective teacher. And so in that way, it would work, right? That she teaches whatever she teaches completely, then you can infer from this that she teaches completely, where this just sort of means she's a real teacher. She's a non-defective case of being a teacher. So that's how I tried to make that inference intuitive.
Do I have time?
Good question.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, maybe I won't add further, but I'll just state this pleasure, and then we can talk about it, publicly state this pleasure, and then we can talk more about it later. So the worry on the first question is that, and we haven't really improved on this. Brown also says the same sort of thing. The Republic inference doesn't work. Plato realizes this later and fixes it in the sophist. So it doesn't look like much of an improvement there. It works, the inference works, but there's a problem with performance, and now we're fixing that in the sophist. So that's my displeasure about the. And then there's also this worry about shifting from this Brownian predicative / existential notion of being to one that's restricted to essential features or essential predicates or some subclass predicates that constitute the thing. What it is, the worry is that I mean, all the linguistic work that is supposed to, by Kahn and others, that's supposed to support Brown may not support this version, this restricted version. Is there some, yeah, anyway, so maybe there's a metaphysical fix, but there's a question about whether it's as natural linguistically and whether the evidence supports it.
Yes. Thanks. We'll talk more about this. These are very complicated issues. I mean, I do think I have somewhat improved on Brown, but whether I'm in a position to solve all the problems in a completely satisfactory way is another question. So I think the upshot probably is going to be that you need to do a fairly sort of significant amount of heavy-duty metaphysical lifting in order to make the linguistic claims go through. I think that's where I'm going to be.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
One of my words was what Gabe mentioned, and yeah, and I would say, like, I mean, like, you have to sort of. You said it would be a virtue of your reading, but only if you are a developmentalist. And like, I personally am not, so it's not. I mean, so I don't think that I don't read the surface as now Plato has sobered up and he fixes like all mistakes, especially since the mistakes seem so sloppy. I mean, it just seems like
Which mistake are you talking about?
I was thinking, like, if I understood you, but I think I looked at schema number 3 and I said, like, I don't understand. I can name any form and say that the form of justice is not the form of beauty, and I would be able to infer the defectiveness of the absolute being from it. So I could say the form of justice is not the form of beauty, and therefore it is, in a way, is and is not. And then I would have to say that what absolutely is defective qua absolutely being. And so, I mean, given that you just kind of plugging, instead of taking a participant for X, you say a form, and you can just do the same thing for, is what I'm. So the way you derive the kind of deficiency of the beings in the case of participants, I think you can derive the deficiency of the forms just by, forcing them to be something that they're not. So, I mean, I think if I can be a good, So I know what it means to try to be a good French teacher and do a good or bad job there. But if now I'm being held up to a standard that isn't actually, that it doesn't make sense for me to be compared to, and then I'm being deemed deficient in that regard. That's the kind of, I mean, I find it hard to read Plato that way, but because it just seems so dogmatic. I mean, it just seems, where is he getting these standards? Like, and who needs to accept them? And that gets me to my actual question, which is sort of, I know you said that you're interested in the kind of exegetical question of what the census of being, the census is, and I do find it a very interesting question. I also find it interesting that the one sense that Plato specifies in the sophist is left out of the matrix of things that we're considering, namely dunamis. But that's just, there's one place where Plato says what being means, and that's the thing we're not asking about this text. But that's also not my point. My question is just if you can situate me back in the kind of dramatic and dialectical context, because I feel like if I just listen to you, I would assume that the point of this text, what I'm supposed to, like how it moves the conversation forward, is as I get the sense that forms are superior beings and then everything else is inferior. But I take it, as I read it in context, the argument, the point is that there is these lovers of science and science. There are people who deny that there are forms. They think that there are only beautiful things and no one beauty. And somehow now we're getting an argument. And what we're supposed to get at the end of this argument is to persuade these sick people without letting them know that they're sick. This is also the perceived, so you're supposed to give them an argument that gently persuades them that there are forms without telling them that that there's something wrong with it. Can you explain how to get that from your reading?
Right. That's your main question, right? But you also made these sort of the comments at the beginning, and I have a hard time resisting the temptation to engage with the initial points.
Three questions.
Yes. Let me just address very quickly one of the pre-questions, which is these negative predications about forms, right? And whether the fact that there will be negative predications about forms, which is a sort of pretty obvious fact that Plato, even when he wrote the Republic, should have easily been aware of, undermines this construal.
He says it sometimes, it's justice, you say this, right? You never compare forms.
Right. So then what I would like to do, just in order to sort of underline my point, which I made in response to Gabriel's sort of similar challenge, that I think the Republic contains some resources for sort of fixing that problem. So I'm thinking that we can put a fair amount of weight on these expressions in a way. So X is F in a way and X is not F in a way. So you can read in a way as something like only in a way. You can read it as sort of defectively, imperfectly, or something like this. And in this way, I think you can fix the problem so that there will be some negative predications about forms, but there won't be properly characterizable as somehow being defective predications.
My worry is that there will not be a form, because if this is not the form, so that they will have to say that this is their defective forms, because.
But there won't be. That's what I mean. If they, for example, the form of the good, and they say that the form of the good is not the form of beauty, or something like this. You don't need to say that the form of the good in a way is not the form of beauty. You can simply say the form of the good is not, without any kind of qualification or weakening on is, when you say that the form of beauty is not the form of the good or vice versa. I mean, these expressions in a way, what they indicate is that there is something qualified. It's a sort of softener, right, to the predication. So the idea is, for example, that when returning what one owes is just in a way, that it's just only in a way, that there's something defective about the way in which returning what one owes is just. Returning what one owes, in other words, right, is a defective case of being just. Whereas the form of the good is not a defective case of not being the form of beauty. It doesn't depend on perspective, situations, relations, or anything like this. The form of the good is not the form of beauty, regardless of circumstances, regardless of situations, regardless of perspectives, and so on. So I think in this way, one could at least sort of make progress towards solving that problem. It would be different from the sophist solution, but I think that's perfectly fine, right? I'm also not a developmentalist. I'm not thinking that, I don't think that Plato in the sophist tries to fix a problem that his earlier sort of attempt at spelling out being and not being in the Republic raises. I think the Republic does its own thing, and it's sort of internally defensible and justifiable and intelligible. The sophist does another thing. But okay, now I want to turn to your question. Can you remind me briefly what the question was? It always happens like that.
It's just more a request to situate it. I said that I would. Your reading of the argument suggests that the aim of the argument is to show me the deficiency sensible things, and that's not what the aim of what he's supposed to be doing.
Thank you. Right. So I actually don't think that the argument formally introduces forms, and I also don't think that the argument is meant to convince anyone that there exist forms. I think what the argument is doing is to indicate that if you limit yourself to the many beautiful things, then you're going to be limited in your engagement with reality to things which are defective, to defective beings, defective cases of beauty, defective cases of goodness, or whatever. You could think that, one response might be, yeah, that's right, you could embrace that. You could say that all cases of beauty that could come up as cases of beauty are defective. It's a defective world. The world is messy. You can throw, up any example of something which is just, or good, or beautiful. And yes, there are going to be cases where the thing is not beautiful. So then a conclusion or one response to that argument could be that what Plato thinks of as episteme, conceived of as perfect, unblemished cognition, is actually not available. And then the lovers of sights and sounds will be sort of at the point where they concede that the kind of cognition that they have is not perfect. But they might also think that perfect cognition is humanly unattainable. And so they might not be offended by that, and they might be okay with that. It's only later on, I think, in the subsequent...
To deny the distinction between... No, I'm not.
I think there's not a single thing which is.
They deny the difference between the one form and the many participants. They
think that there is no such thing as what is beautiful in the singular, right?
They deny. Okay.
So
I'm asking what they deny is the thing that needs to be shown. I dig it. And I think that what they deny is the distinction between the one, they don't say that, so they understand that there is a topic, justice, beauty, and then they say, well, there is this topic, and I go to the theater and I learn about justice.
Mm-hmm. Well, they said that you can ask the question, what is just? But they will not accept that there is a single answer to that question that sort of pinpoints the just itself as a single thing. That they deny, right? They think there's no such answer available.
That's the sort of thing that Socrates confronts them with. I mean, but I'm kind of thinking they don't. That there is a Socrates that walks around and asks this question doesn't mean that they think that there is. That you go and you contemplate justice by kind of thinking, going to the theater and dealing with all these conflicts and
yes.
Right. So
consider cases.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. And they think that they're like Blackman says that they're learners. They think that they learn something. So they think that they're learning beauty and so what I take it that they are denying is now Socrates tells them, yes, there is one justice and I'm asking you, whatever, what is virtue? And what pisses them off, and they are pissed off, is that they say there is no, let's talk about like Sophocles.
Yes.
And so he gives them an argument that is supposed to persuade them that his question makes sense and that there is an answer to it and that they are not after it and that how they go about it is not a way that would ever, reveal to them the nature of the topic that they claim to be learning. I mean, that's kind of my reading. That's not like it. Yeah,
I'm afraid we'll have to move faster.
Explain the question, at least.
If we move on?
Yes.
Sorry. So we have 15 minutes left and several questions left too. So please be brief, as brief as possible. So now, Carolina.
Thank you. The very brief is about the objects on which each doctoral study are set over and how your reconstruction deals with it. So the thing is, in your scheme, the object should be primarily X, and then it's developed into X is F, and F becomes another problem, right? So the problem is, for me, that so X should be in every way, and this is a form. So, and then we say, oh, X is not in every way because it's not in every way a form, and that's how it feels. But so let's take here two examples on beauty and justice. So what you have there is that, for example, the green is beautiful and the green is not beautiful. So green is X and green is X,
Right.
that is F and not F.
Right.
So the point is, the whole argument depends on a previous predicate, which is the bird is green and the bread is green. So because the bird is green and the bread is green, green is F and green is not F. So green is a candidate for F, is not a candidate for X, because then you could say, so X, the bird, which is the primary. So there are two levels of
Yes.
of sentences here, and one is giving a cause. So green is a candidate for F for being the cause of X is F, being true or not true. So I think that's the hard part, and this has to do with what are we talking about, objects and of doxa and episteme and how they differ, because the whole point of the arguments is to show that the grounds for which the objects that do the part of their candidates for being beautiful, which is a math and not X, and not the candidates of X, and this is another problem. Does it make sense to you?
I think so. So I think the one move you make, right, is to call attention to the sort of layers of predication.
Yes.
That we can say that green is beautiful, but the green itself features as a predicate of the bird, right? The bird is green. So that's one sort of X is F kind of structure. And when we say that green is beautiful, we're using something that's a predicate at the lower level of predication, now as a subject of predication at the higher level.
Exactly, because you can only say that green is beautiful or it's not beautiful because you have these other levels of predications. In which green features as a map, as a candidate, as a ground for the, and there are examples in later life, not because of the color that in the field, right? It's not because of the color that something is beautiful.
Yes.
So green is a candidate for F and not a candidate for X. And
It's both. I wouldn't say it's both. Because we certainly can form the predication that green is beautiful. Or, for example,
but you cannot prove that without the example that you.
No, I think I'm okay with that. So I think what the upshot of this fact that you're calling attention to for my interpretation is, and this connects with an interaction between Edward and me earlier, the upshot I think is going to be that the domain of doxa, that's to say the many Fs, is going to be sort of metaphysically diverse.
We are going to have birds in there because the bird is beautiful, but also in a way it fails to be beautiful, right? If you compare the bird with Aphrodite or whatever, the Hippias point, then it fails to be beautiful in that context of comparison. Also, the bird will not always be beautiful, even though it's extremely beautiful right now, etc. So birds will be in there as examples of the many beautiful things, the many Fs, and so as objects of doxa, but also the kinds of things that can be predicated of birds, or some of the things that can be predicated of birds, such as the iridescent green of the bird, that will also count as one of the many beautiful things. So the many beautiful things will be a sort of metaphysically diverse kind of group of things.
Yeah, the point is you don't have an argument for birds being beautiful or not beautiful.
Why not? I can make it. I just did.
You need a second one. What's the cause of their being beautiful and not being beautiful? So
I mean, the cause of their being beautiful, of course, is the form of beauty, right? In which they participate.
that's how you do, it makes the difference between episteme and doxa, because the causes that you provide for this being beautiful or not being beautiful are based on sensible things. And not that the problem is not on X's. The problem is on F's, candidates of F's.
Okay. So, on the paper I have, the idea is that among the objects of Doxa, there will be all kinds of different things, including the sort of perceptible individuals that we're familiar with, such as this bird, Helen, and so on, but also all kinds of other things which are perceptible and are cases of being a beautiful or a just thing, as opposed to beauty itself, justice itself. Those will be the objects of episteme.
Okay, but the problem is, if you take the bird and you say bird is the form of the bird, is innocent of the form of the bird, it's very hard for you to say it's also not a bird. You see, there's not only.
Why not? So you point to a particular individual bird, and you want to now support the claim that there is a way in which this is not a bird?
Yeah.
You can do it.
What?
Because at one time it's a bird, at another time it's not. When it ceases to be a bird, it dies, it's no longer a bird, so it's not a bird. That's one of the moves in the symposium. In the symposium, we get the idea that the form of beauty is something which is beautiful always, invariably, as opposed to coming into being and passing out of being as a case of beauty.
Yeah. Well, I think you have to leave it here because I don't know, but I think we have to talk a little bit more.
Sure, I'm happy to talk more.
Yes.
Well, this my question becomes just superfluous now because there's one point I wanted to make, not the bird example, but another example, which is a notorious example in the Republic later on, the finger. And I guess the more general question I wanted to ask concerns your two options, interpretive options. Your more daring metaphysical interpretation and your more moderate interpretation. Because I see at least two problems with the more daring interpretation. I'm very tempted by it. And with that force retreats to the more modern interpretation. But unlike you, I don't really find the more modern interpretation very satisfying. So So what are the two problems? One has to do with this, that for I understand it, the more ambitious metaphysical reading is more ambitious because it doesn't make this qualification of considered as, exactly, right? But again, if we look at the objects that are both are and are not, so again, we would say that considered as beautiful, it is also not beautiful, and therefore it is and is not. But considered as a finger, one might say that it doesn't make sense to say it's also not a finger. So that considered as a finger would not also be and not be. So it would seem that again we would have to make this qualification of considered as, considered in a certain way, or considered in terms of a certain characteristic. These sensible objects are or not, but considered as birds or as fingers or as horses. They are not, at least not in the same sense, are not, are, and are not. Mm-hmm. That's on that level. On the level of the forms, and I know you try to deal with this problem in the way you formulate your language, but and this was a problem raised earlier in terms of negative forms. But there too, it seems to me you have a problem of saying, okay, so beauty completely is, but only considered as beauty, considered as being. Beauty also is not, because it's not justice, because it's not the good, because it's not other forms. So it isn't completely in the sense of this stronger sense of complete is, where we're completely being, or being completely would mean being everything, complete, right? Completely. So it seems, so that's why I think that in the end, we have to, I wonder if we have forced to retreat to a more modest position, which is to say that the argument works only when you introduce these qualifications of considered under this respect, considered under this other respect. And the report to more modest reading, when I said it doesn't satisfy me very much, is that, of course, we don't have those kind of qualifications in the text. And the text seems to be making a much more general, something much more like your stronger metaphysical position. That seems to be what we find in the text. We don't find any qualifications. And so this is the difficulty I'm having. I mean, I find, the strong metaphysical position seems more consistent with what the text seems to be arguing. But the problem is that they seem negative. To me, it seems that we have to retreat to this more modest position of all specifications. It seems to be harder to square in text. So that's no problem. Let's say we have anything, but don't get to it at all. We can do that in Direction.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, that's very helpful. I don't know whether this will satisfy, but there are sort of two responses that I have at the moment. The first one is about the fingers, and we already talked about birds and so on. So you can predict sort of how I'm going to handle this, right? The idea is going to be that even though later on, right, this is in the central books of the Republic, we get the idea that with respect to fingers, we don't get sort of perplexing perceptions about a finger also not being a finger, but with respect to large and small and many other sort of predicates, we do get, even in sort of perceptual experience, already sort of puzzles, right? Because something seems large in relation to one thing, but small in relation to another, and the same point doesn't apply to fingers, right? But that's consistent with thinking that something which is a finger also always in some way or other will fail to be a finger if you adopt a diachronic perspective, right? So, for example, something which is now a finger will not always be a finger. After the death of the organism that it is a finger of, it will no longer be a finger. Certainly after sort of decomposition, after a while, it won't be a finger anymore. And the temporal sort of qualification is in the symposium list, right, of sort of ways in which cases, the many cases of beauty are defective cases of beauty, right? Because they come into being and they perish. And so I think that can handle the finger case, and nothing in the passage, in the context of the finger passage, negates that. It's just to say that in perceptual experience, fingers do not also present as non-fingers. And that seems fair and compatible with thinking that something which is now a finger is not always going to be a finger. And so in some ways, a defective case of being. So that I think is consistent with the sort of metaphysically bolder picture. The other point that you made, right, about, and this again sort of connects with the point about forms, right, and the problems with negative predications about forms. And just maybe to restate the response that I have in slightly different language, yes, it's going to be the case that forms will fail to be certain things. For example, the form of the good will fail to be the form of beauty, etc. But it can also be upheld that whatever any form is, it is that completely and non-defectively. That there are no ifs and buts to those kinds of claims, even the negative claims about forms. And I think that may be sort of enough if you employ that thought in the right way. I think you can defend the picture in the Republic. But yes, right, the idea will be, yes, there are negative predications that are true of the forms, but nothing that's true of the forms is only defectively or qualifiedly true of the form in question.
I guess maybe the issue that when you say fully completely is, you just have to have fully completely is that.
Well, it is completely and fully whatever it is.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk, Hendrik. I guess I have a completely different reaction than most of the other questions. I'm totally on board with the last point you were just making, in particular because I think of the dialectical context he's arguing against are people. The point is that the thing that is beautiful also appears not beautiful, and the thing that is large also appears not large. So it's always these opposites. So it seems relevant to say not that the negative, I guess I don't see where the concern about negative predication outside of a kind of restricted range of like a domain of meaning, where that's coming from, except from thinking about these things like the sophist. It doesn't seem like it's actually in this particular passage. But I guess that makes, I'm wondering where my thought when you were speaking was, why do I need metaphysics at all? Why isn't this just a point about language and epistemology? So you gave a modest and then a more radical metaphysical picture, and I was thinking, why do I even need to go in that direction, and what in the text is motivating that? So just to give you a sense of what I mean, I'm thinking that, well, maybe, so I thought one thing that you were motivating this with was the idea that for ignorance to be set over what is not, it has to be the case that there's nothing there for, you made this point about the sort of emptiness of ignorance being set over nothing, right? Which is going to create other problems in the sophist and pietists and so forth, right? But I couldn't understand that not as a point about ontology, but a point about predication, that cognition is intrinsically predicative. There has to be some kind of predicational structure. If there is something for which no predicate holds, it's not possible for me to have, contentful cognition of that thing. So I don't need ontology. I just need a picture of thought that is inherently predicative. And then you could tell the story that you were just telling about the opinable and the knowable in the same way, that the object of knowledge is that which in the capacity that it is an object of knowledge. So that is to say, I know the just thing, the beautiful thing. It can't be the case that that object also has predicated of it its opposite, like just, and then opinion will be in the middle, right? But I don't know where I need to start thinking about types of being, except as a way of talking about things that have different predicational structures, right? And then the main point really is just about epistemology and the types of things that count as objects of knowledge, ignorance, and opinion, right? So I guess my with all that in mind, my question is why metaphysics?
Okay, thank you. I think I'm very much on board with the sort of picture that you sketched, that this is primarily about predications and sort of different predicational relations, right? So in particular, the idea that we can distinguish between two kinds of predications, namely ones where the predicate holds of a subject, but the opposite or contrary of the predicate also holds of the subject. And so that sort of weakens the relationship between the predicate and the subject. That's one sort of kind of predication. And the other kind of predication is one can understand that negatively in a way, right? Where the predicate holds of the subject, but the contrary of the predicate does not hold of the subject, so that the relationship between the subject and the predicate is unweakened or unqualified or something like this. I think that's what mainly is doing the work in the argument. And then the idea is, right, that knowledge is going to latch onto objects which have whatever predicates hold of them in the second of these ways, whereas doxa will latch onto objects that have whatever the relevant predicates are in the first of these two sort of ways of having a predicate, the qualified or weakened way of having a predicate. But then it seems to me that sort of once one sees that, it's a very easy next step to think of the sort of two different kinds of predication as generating two metaphysically distinct domains of objects that will be characterized in terms of having whatever predicates they have in qualified and only in qualified ways, and objects that have whatever predicates they have in unweakened and unqualified ways. And then, of course, this gives rise to sort of metaphysical worries and concerns that one may or may not want to confront. And I try to do at least a bit, right, of that sort of confronting of metaphysical worries. But I think I agree with you that the sort of main work is done by sort of thoughts about language, predication, and epistemology. And that the metaphysical sort of pictures that come in only in a secondary and derivative kind of way. But I do think that they do sort of come in a way, and that it would be unwise for an interpretation of this passage sort of completely to avoid or completely to refuse to engage with the metaphysical questions that the picture sort of naturally gives rise to. Does that not seem reasonable to you?
Hold on. John, I'm sorry.
Yes, sorry. Good call. Yeah, at this point, several things that I wanted to say have been raised. One was the idea about the range of predicates, because you said that concerning the features, all the features of sensible things. But it seems that, at least when the object of doxa is introduced in 470 AD, I think it is. The crucial Albert Hammer is used. So it says that thing which is in the middle both is and is not at the same time, right? So I think that must be doing some work, and that's what some people have thought, that this only concerns predicates which have an opposite, and so that the it and its opposite can be true of the thing at the same time. Right. And so substantial predicates are not in the whole thing, and so the finger passage is more reason to deny that. And also, for example, the argument from relatives, right? Where, of course, maybe not by Plato, but clearly in that argument, human is something that is applied. I mean, Socrates is a human in every way, in your view. I mean, it's not defectively human, but it is not equally. It's effectively equal to anything. So I just wanted to ask you about that, about the role of the Albert Hammer in introducing the central, I mean, which is the most important thing, right? Identifying the objects of doxa.
Yes. Okay. Well, of course, on the Hammer, you can go at least in two different ways, right?
You can go temporal or you can go logical. And one could sort of sidestep the concern by going logical, right? So the idea will just be that with respect to, for example, a finger, it will be true both. So I'm now sort of translating Hammer as really just both. That it is a finger and that it's not a finger, though at different times. So that's available if you construe the Hammer logically rather than temporally. But of course, if you construe the Hammer temporally, then we will restrict ourselves, right, to sort of synchronic situations, and then sort of relational or sort of contexts of comparison or perspectival readings, right, will be the right ones to go to. The symposium passage does, right, as we said a number of times, sort of introduce as one resource one can avail oneself of, right, sort of diachronic differences and fluctuations coming into being and going out of being. And if you read the Hammer logically, you can avail yourself of that. But I am also sort of attracted by another kind of picture, which is that possibly on Plato's view, and there are, of course, texts that go that way, for example, the Timaeus, to be a human being will be sort of analyzable in terms of having a number of sort of features that come together at a particular point in the receptacle or something like this. So that being a human being is somehow sort of an epiphenomenon of certain kinds of features sort of coming to be aligned at a particular time for a particular period of time, sort of a cluster of properties kind of view, right, of substances. One person, right, who has discussed this kind of topic at length is Wolfgang Mann, right, in his book on things, which is sort of in the title about Aristotle, but half of it is about Plato, right? And so he has the view that in Plato, in the Theaetetus, and also in the Timaeus, there is some sort of reductive analysis of things to clusters of features, which is why he then thinks that it took Aristotle to sort of discover things, right, as such. That's also available, right, as a sort of analysis of the metaphysical picture. In support of this, there's also the idea that we may be restricting ourselves to features of things that have opposites or contraries, right? The striking thing about the argument, right, is that the beautiful things are also ugly, the just things are also unjust, the pious things are also impious. So maybe we're restricting ourselves to features or attributes of things that have contraries, and human being or finger doesn't have an obvious contrary, right? And so then the sort of effectiveness of the intermediate things might sort of reside in the fact, and exclusively reside in the fact, that for all the features that they have that admit of opposites, they also have those opposites. Then, of course, there's a question of what to make of fingers, human beings, and so on and so on. One way to go might be to say that sort of those are not the metaphysically privileged kinds of features of things, in having which the being or the defective or qualified being of things actually consists. And Wolfgang Mann has developed a view along those lines, and I find that attractive, and I'm sympathetic to it. But I also want to sort of keep my options open, sort of as an interpretation of that argument at the end of Republic 5. And I do think that the diachronic reading that uses the symposium idea of sort of being and not being over time at different times is available, but then you have to read the Hammer logically, not temporally.
Yeah, but it's never true that Socrates is not human.
Why?
It's never true. It is never true that Socrates is not human. It is true that
You can point to Socrates and say he will not always be.
He was human.
This will not always be human.
he was human, but it's never true that he's not human.
Okay, this depends on how you sort of think about Socrates.
I'm sorry for being so over.
You're doing your job.
Running late already, so Andre?
No. Well, it was a curious question. Actually, you have this classical distinction, essential, dedicated, and veridical.
Only to reject it, so, right?
Yes, exactly. So I wonder how much of this you reject and how you actually would name and ground your own position, because you spoke about another kind of but another sense of being. No? So it's not the tree, it's not on the tree, that's some other sense. And then you say this is within, or Leslie Brown says, or the analysis relies on it being available in the Greek language. Well, at some point, Gabriel said, in order to describe your position, existential predicative.
No.
Merged. So, what about a line of interpretation that would say it's actually not in the Greek language? It's a Parmenidean discovery. And if it's a Parmenidean discovery, how would you qualify this discovery? And the word that comes to my mind is essentialist sense. An essentialist sense has the advantage of being predicative in a sense, which could say it so is, and perhaps that has the virtue to, give whatever is due to Parmenides.
That's a really interesting suggestion. I need to think about that. I don't have a sort of quick response to it, but my sort of the one thing that I would like to say, just by way of clarifying sort of my interpretation, is that I don't mean to add another sort of sense or meaning, at least sort of the way where I am now. I need to think more about your suggestion of basically adding a fourth use or meaning of Ani, namely the essentialist use of Ani discovered by Parmenides and taken up and developed right by Plato. That would be the idea. Prior to thinking about this, my current thought is that it's a mistake to distinguish between the existential and the predicative. The Greek language is innocent of that distinction. It's a sort of late, so I think that the idea of existence is a later philosophical development that is not yet there when we're talking about Parmenides, Plato, or for that matter, Aristotle. Aristotle may have a lot to do with the sort of discovery or invention of the concept of existence, but I think Parmenides and Plato are innocent of it, so that it would be a mistake to think to accept an existential and the predicative sort of use or meaning, and then to sort of construct what Plato is doing by merging the two. That would be sort of methodologically getting things backward, because it's to sort of import a later notion and then to sort of contaminate one's understanding of the earlier idea by introducing it. The idea would rather be, think about, for example, the English verb to teach, and think about the relationship between teaching and teaching French, and then try to sort of get your mind around Ani, sort of along those lines, right? You wouldn't think that teaching is some kind of merger between an unsupplemented meaning of to teach and a supplemented meaning of to teach. That would be a really weird way of thinking about the meaning of the verb to teach, right? So the proposal would go somewhat along those lines. But I will think more about the idea of adding a fourth meaning discovered by Parmenides. But you are sympathetic to the idea that the idea of existence is a later philosophical construct.
It's an existential, actually. It exists really well. Yes. But existence is limited in time, as you said. We are not talking about the existence that, as I think you also think, about essence.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.